afternoon, everybody. I'm Kim Coble, Executive Director of the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, and I'm very excited to have this conversation today. We're going to go over the 2022 election results for Maryland. If you're a conservation voter, you should be in a good mood. That's the bottom line here. So I'm joined by experts. We have Kristen Harbison, who's our political director. Has been with us since 2015. I have Nika Duckett Randolph, who has been with us this year as our elections manager. And I'm very pleased to have Casey Hunter from Common Cause, who's been on the ground working election protection issues. So we're going to hear from each of them in just a minute. I wanted to start out acknowledging the historical moment that has occurred in Maryland. We had a statewide election that every statewide office and every member of General Assembly was up for election this year. And that hasn't occurred for 75 years. So it's been a very historic election process. Additionally, the results are historic. For the first time in the history of the state, we have two African Americans at the statewide offices, the governor and the attorney general, and we have a woman as in a statewide office as comptroller. So we have a lot to be proud of for the state and, as I said, as conservation voters. So let me jump into the details here and get started. So I want to have both Kristen and Nika talk about election results. I'm going to have Kristen go over just some top line results, not necessarily who won and who didn't win, but our analysis of the data and some of the behind the scenes look at what we're seeing that you may not be aware of. So Kristen, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And this is really exciting for those of us who are political nerds. Election day, or what is now election week or election 2 weeks, is really kind of like our Super Bowl. And so this has been a really exciting time. And and the results are really interesting. A lot of, the results have been widely reported, and, there's not of where pundits had said, oh, this is going to be a terrible, the Democrats are going to lose all over the place. And that's not what happened. But underneath that, in Maryland, that is especially true. And this is conservation candidate. People ran on the environment, and those candidates won. And as a result, we have a stronger conservation majority in the Senate, with the Democrats having picked up 2 seats. Both of those candidates ran on the environment in very difficult districts, and won by one by a very slim margin at this point, but growing, and one has started out behind and gained in mail-in votes, and is now several thousand votes ahead. So that's huge. And in 4 states, and there are 4 new seats in the House in Hagerstown, in Baltimore County, in Howard County, and in Anne Arundel County. Again, all candidates who ran on the environment. And so that's a really big deal. One of the other stories I think has been interesting is nationally, there was upheaval in Pennsylvania, and that means a lot to Maryland, because we will now have people, and again, these are people who ran on environment. Our partners in Pennsylvania did a heroic job of getting conservation voters elected. And now we will have partners in Pennsylvania in a way that we haven't had for a while that will help us get to meet our Bay cleanup goals. So that's a really important piece. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is how it shows the demographic shifts in Maryland. Wes Moore won 10 out of the 10 out of 24 jurisdictions. But a couple of the jurisdictions where he did that he lost, but he did very well, include places like Wicomico County, where in the deep eastern shore, and that actually reflects demographic changes in the state that have come up, that we've been hearing about stories about people moving into Maryland from places like Pennsylvania and New York, especially to the Eastern Shore during the pandemic, where if we can work from anywhere, we want to work from a place where we love, and we love Maryland's Eastern Shore. So they've repopulated. So that shift, I think, is what we started to see, which is really interesting. And it'll be interesting to see how some of those results play out, and where, as more numbers come in, how we're able to shape, we're able to see what other trends there are underneath some of those, the big high profile numbers that we're seeing. But Nika, I think, Nika saw a lot on the ground through the work she did, so I'll turn it over to her.
Thanks, Kristen. So yeah, I mean, working on the ground during the elections, both in the cycle of the primary and in the general, it was very clear that voters cared about what was going on in the environment, and they cared to make that known at the ballot box. Goucher had released a poll ahead of the primary back in June, and the environment was one of top 2 issues for voters across both parties. So it's a nonpartisan issue. It's something that everybody is caring about, that people are paying attention to. And it was enough to get people out to vote. And that's being reflected in the results that we see. That's how we have these allies in Pennsylvania now. They flipped it to help the Bay, because that's what they're concerned about. And some other really interesting stories that I found working on the ground was about how the elections were working for people, right? People in general typically did appreciate the long margin of early vote. It was a week long, and the hours, were pretty flexible. So people had the opportunity to come out more. I saw a lot of first-time voters when I was out there, specifically for early vote. And they were a lot of younger voters, a lot of, high schoolers and things. And they were activated, they were engaged, they were, aware and excited. Which I thought was interesting, because if you, read the news or look at the stories, they tell you that, young folks don't care and they're apathetic and they don't want to vote, but that just simply wasn't true here. So I definitely can't wait for the numbers to come out to see what the percentage of voters like that were. And then also too, we had some partners who were doing some amazing work for some specifically marginalized populations. Our friends at Disability Rights Maryland, they ran a phenomenal campaign. They actually went into state hospitals to register people to vote, but then also assist them with their ballots. So, they were really intentional about reaching out to different populations and removing ballot access barriers for folks. And then we've had amazing partners in the Expanded Ballot Coalition, like Life After Release and Out for Justice and Common Cause and ACLU Maryland, who they were really involved in on the front line of making sure incarcerated voters or returned citizens, could navigate the voting process and be registered. They, met with 24 of the state county jails and trained their admin on how to have elections from behind the bars. And this year will be the first year we get metric numbers, like data back from those things. So that's really exciting to see as well, because I do know Maryland does have one of the healthiest democracies in the state, right? But we're only as good as we do for our most vulnerable population. So, while it's a beautiful thing that elections are very accessible for the everyday Marylander, we really can't claim, to have the healthiest and best election until that access is spread wide for everyone. And there was just amazing work and victories done on the ground this year for that.
Thank you, Nika and Kristen. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the results, we had about 1.7 million voters for the governor, lieutenant governor slate. And in 2018, another midterm election, there was about 2.2, 2.3 million. So the reduction in turnout was related to the Republicans. There was 600,000 fewer Republicans on average that voted in that race, the governor, lieutenant governor. I think that speaks to the quality of the candidate for the Republican Party and people not being enthused. But the turnout across the board was less this midterm than last midterm. So something to keep in mind as we move forward. We want to make sure as many people are voting as and have access to election ballots and whatnot across the board. So let me turn to Casey. And as I said, Casey's with Common Cause, another partner of ours. They've done some phenomenal work around election protection. If you've been watching the national news at all, there's been threats. There's been not necessarily attacks, but questions around voter integrity and election integrity. And I want to hear from you, Casey. What did we see in Maryland? How did Maryland's elections compare to what is across the state? And maybe some on the ground stories from you as well. So thank you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Casey Hunter. Very happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I stepped in mid-October, very last minute, to run our field operation for election protection volunteers. So I think there was definitely a heightened anxiety going into this election. That was from us, from our volunteers, from judges, just with things, whispers in the news. Thankfully, we did not see the level of intimidation or conflict across the board in Maryland that we were expecting. There was that call for rushing the polls at 6 p.m. by some more conservative candidates to try to gum up the lines, things like that we didn't really see manifest, luckily. And there's been a really interesting, shift in voting since the pandemic. So there was heightened concern about, drop boxes, as we saw with Arizona. We had a few instances, more isolated here, really. Not a lot of systemic, not a lot of bigger issues, more isolated incidents of intimidation this year. But yeah, across the board, it was much calmer than we all had anticipated and planned for, which was great. But we had our hotline up and ready. 866 our vote was our partnership, our hotline for this year. And it was great. We got like 200 calls. So people can just report if you're out in the field, whether you're a voter, whether you're a volunteer, calling in to ask questions, getting a live response from those on the other side of that hotline. So we had a good amount of calls. But like I said, sorry?
Were people reporting intimidation in those calls, or were they more general questions?
So it's both. So we'll get a lot of questions like, hey, how can I find that I'm at the right polling place? Stuff like that. But then on the complete flip side, we do have people reporting those more severe instances of intimidation. I think, interestingly, there was a lot of confusion coming from judges themselves with, lack of training, things like that. So we saw some hiccups in terms of, late openings, or a very strange phenomenon that popped up this year with some judges pausing periodically inside for counting. There were some places where it was up to every hour they were pausing for like 10 minutes. So that taking 10 minutes out of every hour, that's a big chunk of voting time. So some things like that. There were some individual volunteers, intimidating voters in the parking lot, stuff like that. But that seemed very, very isolated. Thank goodness. Yeah.
And just for clarifying for everybody, you get these calls and you answer them to your best of your ability, but are there any follow-up actions that you take?
Yeah, absolutely. So the hotline, we partner with law firms. So they'll have lawyers on the other end. That's who's going to be answering those calls. And if they can't, just get it sorted out with the voter or whomever's on the line right then, they'll escalate it for us. So then that's when we would step in and really be reaching back out to people, saying, here are next steps of how we should approach this. Maybe it's us flagging an issue for the local board so that they can go in and address it. So yeah, most of the time the question can be answered by the lawyer on the line, but those kind of broader, more nuanced issues, they'll get flagged for us so that we can give everybody the right resources and information of how to address it.
Great. So let me turn to you and Kristen now and talk a little bit about why do you think Maryland had less than we anticipated, less intimidation, less threats coming through? Can you attribute that to anything in particular?
I think that, like you said, there was a decrease in more conservative turnout. And I think that most of those, calls for rushing the polls, stuff like that, is coming from that end. So I think that it was maybe overemphasized as how much of an issue it would really be, given the political makeup of our state. So I think that the people that would, be kind of answering that call to go and create problems, like you said, they just didn't really turn out as much. Yeah, so I think that the candidates that were running, the options, I think that definitely impacted how excited people were and how likely they were to kind of answer those calls.
Let me just remind folks, if you have any questions you want to ask, go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll pick them up in the last 5-10 minutes or so. So please go ahead and submit them in there and we'll manage that. Let me turn to you guys and talk about the election judges. There was the rush to get election judges, right? We didn't have enough across precincts. And what was the impact of that? And why do you think that is? How do we get around it next time? And maybe let's start with a brief description about what an election judge does. Kristen, you want to tackle that first?
I was going to defer to Casey, but if you voted, I mean, what an election judge just checks people in, makes sure that everything is that people get the information, they get the correct ballot, that they walk them through the process of getting them to the place where they can make their choice, putting them through the machines, putting the ballots through the machines, and monitoring and making sure that everything is going smoothly. And I think that the work that was done by partners like Common Cause and the Everyone Votes Maryland coalition that Common Cause spearheads, I think did a lot of work, a lot of good to really de-escalate the fear factor around the elections and people. And there were a lot of works like the parties at the polls. Nika did a spectacular job helping to organize a party at the poll in West Baltimore, and they were all over the state. I think that getting those people, when people are excited about something, if it becomes a party, then it's going to be less likely to be acrimonious. And I think the people who turned out to vote were really excited to vote. One of the things I think was really exciting about that I hadn't seen before, and maybe I just hadn't seen it before, but there was a real effort to, I think, engage high school students to participate at the polls as election assistants, not the election judges per se, but as helping people to giving information to the voters, helping to monitor the lines, helping to make sure the election judges had what they needed and provide the supports, even if it's giving out stickers, the I voted stickers that everybody loves so much. And I thought that was a really terrific initiative. And I'm not sure who initiated that and how that happened, but I thought it was really outstanding. And especially as we're wanting to look at building up our electorate and getting people engaged in the electoral process is something that's not just a right and a responsibility, but really a privilege and something to get excited about.
Yeah, it's one of the favorite parts of election time for me is watching young people join their parents or join their family members voting and really instilling that early on. So very excited about that. One of the things that, if I have this correct, out of the 1.7 million that voted, 1 million of them were voted on election day. So the majority of people still go out on election day, cast their vote. And as you suggested, Chris, and we, getting some enthusiasm and energy and even some incentive to go vote has been a big part of the strategy. And I know, Nika, maybe you can share a little bit about what a party for the poll really is. I don't know if people are familiar with that.
Yeah, so a party at the poll is just exactly what it sounds like. There's music, there's DJ, there's, like a live DJ, there's food, there's giveaways. It's really just a good time. It's not about supporting a specific candidate. It really is just about thanking and supporting, and incentivizing voters to come out. Because who wouldn't want to go to their poll if there's going to be, a party there, some music, some vibes, free food, gifts and things. So that's one of the ways in which, we try to sway the turnout, And some of our partners did those too as well. And I do think they do help to turn out voters, especially in low propensity areas, because it's just an incentive for people to come out to vote.
Yeah. I missed the party, but I was glad to see that we participated. Casey, anything more on the election judges and what we need to do to make sure that we have trained, well-paid, well-staffed election judges in 2024?
Yeah, and apologies if you can hear my dogs barking in the background. I think, like I was saying, I think that a lot of the issues that we saw this year did come from the lack of expertise in election judges. A lot of people who, maybe had volunteered a lot before as election judges, they're not coming back as much. And I think that the threats of political violence, I think a lot of people are nervous on top of COVID, being inside and being so close to other people. There were instances of judges being trained the morning of their shift and going and running it. So I think going forward, it just needs to be a lot more proactive and making sure that these people are really trained, not just like, great, you came to a Zoom and now you can go. I think there needs to be a bit more specialized training because with that, we, like I said, saw a lot of judges that maybe just didn't understand certain things because they're new. But we also had a heightened fear, which led to a lot more police presence this year at the polls. Judges were a lot more likely. We saw a big uptick of them calling in law enforcement, out of concern that something might happen or maybe something did happen. So that was, I think, an interesting impact of that. And that has, a lot of downstream effects when you have police presence at the polls. So yeah, I just think more training across the board to have a more consistent and streamlined experience for voters at different polling places. Because I think there, as a result, was a lot of inconsistency this year.
Interesting.
Yeah,
that's something definitely for all of us. If you're a voter and you care about elections, that's something all of us need to be working on in the next 2 years. So look forward to partnering with everyone on that. I'm going to start hitting the questions that are coming in. There's some good questions here. Let me, I've got them, so don't worry if you're not first, but Kristen, 2 for you. There's a question from Sam who is asking about the percentage of mail-in versus absentee ballots and how does that compare to previous years. I know we were talking about this. We don't have that breakdown, but we do have early voting. And so can you just run through that those statistics for us?
Sure. Well, so first of all, like the idea, so mail-in ballots, what we called absentee ballots, or now we call mail-in ballots. It's voting remotely. It's voting from home. And it's a little bit hard to compare this election from other previous elections because mail-in ballots became universal in 2020 because of the pandemic in the primary, and it was not universal in the general, but it was still heavily weighted towards mail-in ballots and putting mail and the information we don't have is about drop boxes and who uses drop boxes, which I think actually still would be captured by the mail-in ballot numbers that are on the website. But we do have, but there were there were over 1 million of the mail-in ballots for the gubernatorial election that were done in person, that were not mail-in ballots, that were the election day voting was still over 1 million Marylanders this year.
And I think there were roughly
Yes.
350 somewhere. You want to go through those numbers?
Yeah. So roughly just under 400,000, about 379,000 early votes and 312,000 mail-in ballots. And some of those numbers, those numbers will fluctuate a little bit because I think today is the last day that mail-in ballots that were postmarked on election day can be received and counted. So those are, and so again, it will be interesting to see how those trends continue. The mail-in ballots changed the dynamic. People who won on election night are not going to be sworn into office because of the weight of the mail-in ballots, which changed the dynamics in dozens of races.
And Kristen, real quickly, somebody's looking for an update on 9A.
Don't we all want to know about that one? So that's one of the last House of Delegate. I think that is the last House of Delegate race that people think is still in play. At the moment, the top vote getter in that election is environmental candidate Natalie Ziegler, who was one of our priority. I mean, that was a race that we put a lot of organizational muscle into. Natalie Ziegler will be sworn into office. She's the top vote getter. Second is, at the moment, is Trent Kittleman, who's an incumbent Republican. But the second Democratic candidate in that race is only down by a little bit, I think 68 votes last time I looked, 20 minutes ago. And those votes are being counted today. So that could still change, but it will be decided by a handful of votes at the end.
Yeah.
It's nail biting.
Yeah. So thank you. And then there's a question about what's called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And we don't have a lot of time to jump into this, but I'll just say that this is a program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the Mid-Atlantic states. Maryland is a member of it. Other states are members of it. And whether or not that's at risk because of the congressional flip in the House, hopefully not. Hopefully the regional program will continue. We've heard from Governor-elect Moore that he's very strong on climate policy, and we hope that Maryland would stay engaged with this. It's a great program, brings in a lot of money for the state. So we're going to continue to push that we stay engaged. So hopefully that's the case. So let me, in the last minute, I think we've got it. In the chat is a link to our endorsed candidates. Maryland LCD endorses candidates, and we work very hard to get them elected. We have all of that up to date on the website and continue to link it to the State Board of Elections. So it's a resource for you on conservation candidates. So please go to that. And I just want to thank you all for being here. It's great to have such a good turnout on a great day with election results. Casey, thank you very much for your work and for joining us. Kristen and Nika, as always, appreciate everything you've done too. I hope everybody has a very safe, happy, and prosperous Thanksgiving. Take care, everyone.